Clara, a young nurse struggling to survive, receives an unexpected proposal to care for a seriously ill millionaire, the enigmatic Mr. Montenegro. But what seemed like just a job to earn a living quickly turned into a whirlwind of mysteries and dark secrets. Clara watched the dim morning light filter through the worn curtains of her kitchen. Before her, a growing pile of bills piled up, creating a suffocating presence in her mind. I had been looking for a solution for weeks, sending out CVs for all kinds of jobs, but so far, no response. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of growing despair. At 28 years old, Clara was used to facing challenges. Raised in an orphanage, she learned early on that she couldn't depend on anyone but herself. Her work as a nurse was her passion, but opportunities had become scarce. Furthermore, a recent physical fragility was beginning to take hold in her body, with dizziness and constant fatigue that she struggled to ignore. As she looked through the job ads once again, the sound of the phone broke her out of her thoughts. An unknown number flashed on the screen, and, moved by a ray of hope, she answered. "Hello?" Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good afternoon, Clara, this is Isabel Montenegro," began the voice on the other side, firm and direct. "I urgently need a nurse to take care of my husband. Someone recommended your name." Clara was surprised by the unexpected call. It had been months since I received a concrete proposal to work in the area. I don't remember applying for this position," he muttered, trying to remember. "It was my husband, Mr. Montenegro, who heard about your services," Isabel explained without hesitation. "We need someone with your experience. Can you come to our house today?" Clara hesitated for a moment, but her financial needs pushed her to accept the offer quickly. "Of course, I can go immediately," he replied with determination. A few hours later, Clara found herself in front of a mansion that exuded luxury and power. Upon entering, she was greeted by Isabel, an elegant woman, but with a severe air. Isabel led her around the house while talking about her husband's health in a way that made Clara uneasy. "Mr. Montenegro was diagnosed with a rare disease," said Isabel, without changing her controlled tone. "The doctors say he has little time to live, but honestly, I think they exaggerate." There was something about the way Isabel spoke that made Clara feel uncomfortable. The coldness with which she approached her husband's situation, as if it were a simple issue to be resolved, was disturbing. Even so, Clara knew she needed that job, so she didn't show her doubts. "I would like to meet you before I make any decisions," Clara said, trying to sound professional. Isabel nodded slightly. "Come with me, I'll take you to him." Clara took a deep breath, knowing that this meeting could be the beginning of something much bigger than she imagined. Clara walked in silence through the corridors of the Montenegro mansion, following Isabel's determined steps. The opulence of the place was evident in every detail. Glittering chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and the furniture was sumptuous, but everything seemed devoid of warmth. The heavy silence of the house was interrupted only by the soft sound of the two women's footsteps. They arrived at a large but gloomy room. There, lying on a bed with thin sheets, was Mr. Montenegro. The man's thin and fragile figure contrasted with the grandeur of the environment around him. His pale, tired face revealed the weight of the illness that was slowly consuming him. Hearing the two women enter, he opened his eyes with effort, trying to focus on the new presence. "Mr. Montenegro, this is Clara, the nurse I told you about. She can take care of you from now on," Isabel said, her voice cold and calculating. Clara approached the bed, studying the man carefully. With every breath he took, it felt like his body was fighting something much bigger. His eyes, however, were bright, as if there was still something behind that weakened appearance, something that kept him steady. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Montenegro," Clara said softly, trying not to show how much his fragility shook her. He tried to smile, but then he started coughing, a heavy cough that shook his entire body. Clara instinctively moved forward, adjusting her position on the bed and trying to ease her breathing. During the brief moment of excitement, he realized something wasn't right. He wasn't being properly cared for. "You have the hands of an angel, ma'am," Mr. Montenegro murmured, after catching his breath. His green eyes were full of gratitude. Clara smiled back, although the concern remained. "I'm here to help you with anything you need." Isabel, who had remained silent until then, observed the scene with a neutral expression. "He will be in your care now, Clara. I will leave you alone for now." The woman turned and left the room, without waiting for a response. As Isabel walked away, Clara felt a mix of emotions. Mr. Montenegro seemed to be in a much worse situation than she had imagined, and his wife's indifference didn't help matters. Still, Clara knew that this was a job she couldn't refuse. He needed her. Over the next few minutes, Clara helped Mr. Montenegro settle in better, checked his vital signs and adjusted his medications. He felt a strange connection with that lonely, sick man. Perhaps it was the weight of her own loneliness that made her identify with him. "Clara," he said with difficulty, "there is something I need to ask you. Something very important." Clara had barely finished arranging the medicine on the bedside table when she heard Mr. Montenegro's weak but determined voice. "I need your help with something out of the ordinary," he said, his expression tense. "It's not something you normally ask of a nurse." Clara stopped what she was doing and looked directly at him, waiting for him to continue. "I need you to pretend to be my daughter, for a day," he said, with difficulty, each word carrying evident emotional weight. At first, Clara thought she had heard wrong. "Excuse me, can you repeat that?" he asked, not completely believing what he had just heard. Mr. Montenegro took a deep breath. His pale and tired face demonstrated the seriousness of the situation. "I know this sounds strange, Clara, but I'm dying. And there are things, unfinished business, that need to be resolved before I leave. My wife, Isabel, she has her eye on my inheritance and will do everything to ensure that total control remains with her. But I have another desire, another intention. Something I can only do if there is someone who can pretend to be my daughter." Clara felt her stomach turn at the request. It wasn't just the absurdity of the situation, but also the vulnerability of the man faced with it. His mind was spinning for some logic, but there was no denying the urgency in Mr. Montenegro's voice. "Why me?" Clara asked, her voice full of doubt. "Because you're the only person I can trust right now. Isabel doesn't care about me, she just wants the money. You saved me today. I don't want to leave without leaving my true legacy, and I need someone to be a witness to that. I don't have anyone else." Clara was silent for a few moments. The request was unusual, almost absurd, but there was something in Mr. Montenegro's eyes that moved her deeply. Her situation wasn't easy, and the job could change her life, but this decision was much bigger than she imagined. "I need to think about this," Clara murmured, as she adjusted the sheets around him. Before she could continue the conversation, the bedroom door opened abruptly, and Isabel entered, accompanied by a man in a suit. The atmosphere changed instantly. "It's time, Montenegro," said Isabel, with a biting coldness. "The lawyer is here with the will. We need you to sign the papers now." Clara watched the exchange between the two, and her heart sank. Isabel didn't seem to be worried about her husband's health, just the documents in his hands. Isabel remained at the door, arms crossed, watching Clara's every move with sharp eyes. The lawyer, standing next to her, held a folder with documents that Clara could only imagine were the will that Isabel had mentioned so much. "Let's go, Montenegro," pressed Isabel, approaching the bed. "The lawyer is waiting, and you know this is the right time to settle everything." Clara noticed the tension in the air, something she couldn't ignore. The situation was becoming too uncomfortable, and Isabel's coldness bothered her deeply. Mr. Montenegro looked more fragile by the second, his face pale and sweaty, as if the weight of that decision was sapping his strength. "Not now, Isabel," murmured Mr. Montenegro, trying to get up on the bed. "I'm not ready yet." Isabel narrowed her eyes, clearly irritated by the answer. "Not ready? It's past time to deal with this. You know very well what's at stake here." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. Isabel's intentions seemed dark, almost calculating. And Mr. Montenegro, so fragile, seemed lost in a battle he couldn't win alone. Before he could stop himself, Clara intervened. "Madam Isabel, I think Mr. Montenegro needs a moment. He has just been through a crisis, and forcing him to sign something now could be harmful." Isabel turned to Clara, her eyes cold and appraising. "You're just the nurse here. Mind your duties and leave the family matters to me." The air became thick, and Clara realized that she was getting involved in something much more complicated than she imagined. She needed to quickly decide what to do, as time was running out, and Mr. Montenegro depended on her help. The silence that hung in the Montenegro mansion was broken by the high-pitched sound of the monitors that surrounded Mr. Montenegro's bed. Clara was back in the room, taking care of the patient's vital signs, when a sudden worsening of his condition caused his heart to race. The devices began to beep frantically. Mr. Montenegro's face was even paler, his lips were blue, and his breathing was heavy and ragged. Clara, with years of experience in medical emergencies, reacted immediately. He adjusted the patient's position on the bed and tried to help him breathe more easily, but it seemed that he was becoming increasingly unresponsive. "Mr. Montenegro, please stay with me," Clara whispered, desperate to steady him. But the man's body seemed to give in to the disease that consumed him. Clara looked at the devices, the signals were getting weaker and weaker. She knew she needed to act quickly. With shaking hands, he prepared to perform emergency resuscitation, but was interrupted when Isabel entered the room, with a hard and impatient expression. "Clara, what's going on?" Isabel asked, in a voice more irritated than worried. "He's going into shock," Clara replied, as she placed the defibrillator next to the bed. "I need to stabilize him immediately." However, instead of helping, Isabel seemed more interested in something completely different. His eyes fixed on the documents that were on the bedside table, still untouched. The will. It was clear to Clara that Isabel's priority was not her husband's health. "You need to sign the papers now," Isabel insisted, her voice implacable. "You know time is running out, Montenegro." Clara looked at Isabel in disbelief. "He's on the verge of death, and you're worried about that?" But Isabel didn't respond. Instead, he approached the bed, forcing Montenegro to hold a pen to sign the documents. Mr. Montenegro, with his eyes half closed and his breathing becoming increasingly shallow, seemed incapable of doing anything. "No. He can't do that now," Clara exclaimed, placing herself between Isabel and the patient. "If you care about him in the slightest, you'll let me help him." Isabel stared at her with cold fury in her eyes, but before she could react, Mr. Montenegro muttered something faint, something that Clara could barely hear. "Clara, the will needs you." He then broke into a violent cough, and Clara knew she had no more time. She activated the resuscitation equipment and began the procedure, determined to save the man's life. "I knew I couldn't let him die at that moment." He needed her, now more than ever. Hours after the crisis, Mr. Montenegro finally stabilized. His breathing was regular, but he remained unconscious. Clara hadn't left his side since then, worried about what could happen at any moment. Isabel, however, had left the room, apparently frustrated with the lack of progress on what she considered the priority, the will. As Clara waited anxiously for him to wake up, she couldn't stop thinking about what he had said before he lost consciousness. "The will needs you." Those words echoed in her mind, and she knew there was something more to this story that she still didn't fully understand. Determined to find out what was happening, Clara looked at the documents that Isabel had left on the bedside table. With shaking hands, he began to leaf through them. It was Mr. Montenegro's will, and as he read it, the truth began to reveal itself in a devastating way. Isabel wanted all of Montenegro's assets to be left to her, but among the clauses, there was a section that talked about an unknown heir, someone he didn't know existed, but who had been mentioned in an old investigation. It was a daughter he had never met, born from a relationship he had years before. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. Could Montenegro's request for her to pretend to be his daughter be related to this? He didn't know for sure who this heiress was, but he wanted to protect his legacy from falling completely into Isabel's hands. He knew that Isabel would try to take everything for herself, Clara whispered to herself, understanding the scale of Mr. Montenegro's request. As he leafed through the last few pages of the document, something else caught his attention. There was a sealed envelope, with his name written in hand. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, a letter written by Mr. Montenegro revealed the truth: Clara was his biological daughter. Clara remained static for a few moments, trying to process what she had just discovered. The words in the letter still reverberated in his mind. How was this possible? She always believed that she had no family, that she had been abandoned in an orphanage with no connection to the outside world. Now here was the revelation: the man she was caring for, the man she had saved, was her father. The letter explained that Montenegro learned of the possible existence of a daughter shortly before falling ill. He had hired investigators to look for her, and by the time they discovered it was Clara, it was too late for him to tell her in person. Isabel's fear of discovering and manipulating the situation led him to ask Clara to pretend to be his daughter, while he prepared a way to reveal everything to her. Clara felt a wave of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger and, at the same time, a feeling of emptiness being filled. The question she had been asking herself all her life, about who her family was, finally had an answer, but in circumstances she could never have imagined. Before he could reflect on it any further, Mr. Montenegro began to move. Clara ran to the bed, holding his hand carefully. His eyes slowly opened, and he blinked several times, as if he was trying to focus on her face. "Clara," he murmured, his voice still weak. She leaned over, feeling tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, I'm here." Montenegro smiled slightly. "Now you know you're my daughter." Clara just nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I wanted to protect you. Isabel, she would do anything to make sure I didn't find you. I couldn't take the risk. But, now you know. And that's all that matters." Clara felt the weight of his words. Although the revelation was big, she knew that the moment to question or demand deeper answers would have to wait. His focus now was on making sure his father, his real father, survived. In the days following the shocking discovery that Clara was Montenegro's biological daughter, the young nurse did her best to take it all in. Between constant care for her father's health and Isabel's constant presence, Clara felt like she was in a minefield. I knew that Isabel was desperate to finalize the will and, of course, was completely unaware of the truth about Clara. One afternoon, while preparing Montenegro's medicines, Clara heard low, tense voices coming from the hallway. Approaching slowly, she hid near the door to hear better. Isabel was talking to someone, probably the lawyer, and her voice sounded dark and determined. "We have to speed this up. I can't wait any longer. Montenegro is resisting, but it won't last long. When he's gone, everything will be mine, as planned. We can't let an unknown heiress show up and ruin everything." Clara felt her heart race. Isabel was willing to do anything to ensure her greed prevailed. For a brief moment, Clara thought about confronting her right there, but she knew it would be risky. If Isabel discovered her true identity before the right time, she could try to get rid of her. As Clara walked away, an idea began to form in her mind. She needed to act quickly, before Isabel brought her plan to an end. The will had not yet been signed, and Clara knew that her only chance was to convince Montenegro to adjust the document as soon as possible. Only in this way would her true heir be recognized and Isabel would be removed from the inheritance. Later that night, Clara entered Montenegro's room, who was asleep but breathing better. She sat down next to him and held his hand. "I promise that I will fight for you, and for what is truly ours. I will not let Isabel win," he whispered. Determined, Clara knew that the next step would be decisive. The next morning, Clara went to Montenegro's lawyer, whom Isabel had brought to the house. She knew that if she wanted to protect her father's legacy and ensure Isabel didn't get what she wanted, she would need to act quickly and strategically. "I need to talk to you about Mr. Montenegro's will," Clara said, staring at the lawyer with determination. The man looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "With all due respect, Miss Clara, these are family matters, and Mrs. Isabel is already taking care of everything." Clara took a deep breath. It was now or never. "I am the daughter of Montenegro," she declared, her voice firm but full of emotion. The lawyer looked at her, surprised, and Clara wasted no time in picking up the letter that Montenegro had written, explaining everything about his paternity. "Here is the proof. I'm not just the nurse." The lawyer took the letter and read it carefully. The silence that followed was heavy, but after a few minutes, he raised his head. "This changes everything," he said finally. Clara nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. "Yes, it changes. Isabel is trying to manipulate this whole situation. My father can't sign anything until everything is clarified." The lawyer got up from his chair and looked directly at Clara. "I understand. I will need to review this document with Montenegro as soon as he is in a position to talk. As for Isabel, I suggest we keep it a secret for now." Clara agreed. He knew that facing Isabel would be a challenge, but at least now, he had an ally by his side. Before leaving the room, the lawyer stopped. "You must be aware that Isabel will not accept this easily. She will fight with all the weapons she has." Clara already knew that. But now, with the truth on her side, she was ready to face whatever came. Over the next few days, Clara and Montenegro's lawyer worked together in secret while awaiting Montenegro's recovery. Isabel, however, became increasingly impatient and aggressive, realizing that something was beyond her control. She pressured Montenegro to sign the will, but he, already aware of who Clara really was, resisted each attempt. One afternoon, the final confrontation arrived. Isabel, tired of waiting, burst into Montenegro's room with the lawyer by her side, demanding that he sign the papers immediately. His eyes were dark, filled with barely contained fury. "I can't wait any longer, Montenegro. Sign now," she said, pushing the will towards him. Clara was next to Montenegro, her heart racing. But before he could intervene, Montenegro, with a visible effort, spoke. "Isabel. I know what you've been doing," he murmured. "I know you just want my money. But the will you want so much, will never be yours." Isabel remained motionless, confused. "What are you talking about?" Montenegro looked at Clara, and, with a weak smile, continued, "Clara is my daughter. And she is the one who will inherit everything I have." The silence that followed was deadly. Isabel went pale, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "What? This is a lie. She can't be your daughter." Clara stood her ground. "I am his daughter, Isabel. I know this is hard for you to accept, but it's the truth." Isabel tried to approach Montenegro, but the lawyer took a step forward, stopping her. "Lady Isabel, the will has been changed and the documents confirming Clara's paternity are in order. I suggest you don't make any more trouble, or this will all be brought to court." Isabel, defeated, looked at Montenegro with hatred in her eyes. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, before leaving the room, furious. Clara took a deep breath, feeling relief flood her body. Montenegro took his hand, his voice still weak but full of gratitude. "I knew I could trust you, Clara." She smiled, with tears in her eyes. "I will never leave you, father. And I will honor his legacy." In the months that followed, Clara took control of her father's business, while Montenegro slowly recovered. Together, they rebuilt the life they had lost, and were finally able to celebrate the bond they had found, albeit belatedly. Clara, now with a new perspective on life, knew she would never be alone again. Montenegro, in turn, found peace, knowing that his real daughter was by his side, protecting everything he had built, not just the money, but the family connection he so desperately craved.